Worst city country you visited and what made the trip awful? Story 1, Fort Yates, North Dakota. It was September, and my fiance and I were on a road trip. We were driving from Rapid City to Fargo, and we stopped in Fort Yates for lunch. We drive into town, and every house is boarded up and condemned, and every building that looked like it had been abusedness at one point had long been closed. We found the town grocery store and stopped to grab something. As soon as we got out of the car, the homeless people in the town began casing the car, so we noped out of there and drove to Bismarck for lunch. I grew up in poverty, so seeing it isn't as jarring to me as it is to a lot of people. But reservation poverty is different. Everyone looks strung out and miserable. Story 2. Had a great road trip driving all the way down NZ until we got to Invercargill. It has the weirdest aura of menace there. People staring with blank looks. Groups of young men following us, coincidentally appearing several times and having to avoid bumping into them as if they were trying to start or pickpocket. Maybe everyone in town was having an off day, but the only thing I could compare it to was when you walk down the wrong street and suddenly realize you're the center of attention in a way that you really don't want, but the entire place was that way. Story 3. Morecambe, UK. Practically the type specimen of a rundown English seaside town, it's a hole in every way. And the beach has substantial areas of quicksand, though as you vanish into the ground, you might think that a preferable fate to staying in Morecambe. Story 4. Sihanoukville, Cambodia. We gave some places a wide berth the 2 nights we were there, so we didn't see the worst things that I'm sure go on there. But it was in the air. The sleaze and the vice felt omnipresent. Imagine a Liam Neeson or Charles Bronson vigilante movie set in a beach town run by a vaguely Eastern European mob, and you're imagining Sihanoukville. Story 5. Wichita, Kansas. Even by the Lao standards I was expecting, it did not meet. As a random example, in the second largest city in the state of Kansas, when we turned on the radio, there were 11 preacher channels and only 2 music options. Of those, only 1 was secular. This is on the Great Plains where a radio signal should travel 1,000 miles. What is this cultural black hole of a landscape? Story 6, probably Las Vegas, Nevada. The food I had, especially the Chinese and Thai food, was really good and was probably the only reasonably priced food I came across. But I'm from Chicagoland originally, and just walking even in the tourist adjacent areas of Las Vegas/strip/paradise, I've never felt more unsafe in my life. In one night, I was accosted by panhandlers, narrowly dodged a massive fight between dozens of appearing teenagers in front of an LV monorail station. Cops showed up about 20 minutes after I left. I couldn't even go into a Walgreens without somebody at the door or in the store itself sizing me up. The first night I was there, I wanted to save some money because I was arriving very late from Chicago, so I had planned to stay at a hostel catty-corner to the Little White Wedding Chapel. Big mistake. Pretty much everyone at the hostel was abusing, and not just cannabis either. I got a taxi and yeeted out of there at 7 a.m. sharp. Luckily, the Sahara Las Vegas already had a room ready when I got there in the morning and didn't make me wait. Everything about Vegas just reeked, sometimes literally, of despair. I had lived in Portland or formerly, and it didn't even come close to what I experienced in just a few days in LV. Story 7. I visited my friend's hometown. It was the middle of summer and we stayed at the beach most days. The food was great and the scenery was next level. Then she cheated on her boyfriend. I saw her in a different light. She FaceTimed him an hour later and pretended nothing was wrong. We traveled home together and haven't spoke since. Worst trip ever, she just ruined the vibes of our trip. Story 8. Turkey, as a single female visiting female friends. What made the trip awful? Men. As rich as the culture and amazing the food is there, I would never go back again, and I traveled to many places in the world alone. I do know quite a few Turkish people individually, including men, and they are all just normal, kind people. But as a country, I was constantly harassed, utilized, and accosted that I hardly enjoyed the bits that I did. Story 9. Orlando. I don't mean the parks. I mean the time I happened to be in Orlando outside of them. I've never been anywhere else where so many people are so consistently aggressive and mean. At the mall, people, not a person, plural people, would drive behind us in the parking lot, which itself isn't anything I haven't experienced elsewhere. But they'd honk their horns and cuss us out for walking to the car too slowly. Eventually, someone asked politely if she'd take our parking spot, and we were just so happy someone was nice about it, we told her exactly where we parked and said we'd wait for her. We were not surprised to see she had Alabama license plates. On another time, some guy in a black priest robe and that white collar just stopped on the side of the road long enough to call my wife. That was also where we had the most near misses while driving, from so many people either pulling away from the shoulder without looking or turning left from the right lane, right from the left lane. Story 10. New Orleans, Louisiana. I used to love the place when I was in college. I really did. It was wonderful. Music, food, just wonderful. But that's not how it is today. It's like a city doing an impression of New Orleans. I hadn't been there in over a dozen years and went back last summer. The food was lousy. There were homeless people everywhere on Bourbon Saint, which I've never seen before. And hookers patrolled up and down the road, hitting up absolutely everybody, right in front of the cops, so you know, surprise, surprise, that they're in on it. The place has absolutely zero charm now. Story 11, Macau. The stark difference between the uber-rich getaway spots, the local housing projects, the desperation of gamblers, and constant scamming of just about everyone trying to sell you something. Also, our hotel smelled like an open sewer, and we were chased by an angry taxi driver because we asked to be taken to a specific casino, but didn't go inside. We gave him that name because it was a good focal point for us to explore, but had no interest in gambling. When we got out and paid our fare, but then turned into a pedestrian shopping area, he shouted and chased us. I assume he got a kickback for every person he actually brought to the casino and was angry at missing out. Story 12, Niagara Falls, New York. Went there for a family road trip a few years ago. While the falls and park were beautiful and we made the most out of the trip, the city is an absolute ghost town and a complete dump. Nowhere to eat, nothing to do. Had to eat at a Hard Rock Cafe, which I'm still perplexed about it still existing. We couldn't figure out why so many hotel reviews warned us about vagrants, or where to safely park your vehicle or walking at night. But once we got there, we figured out why. Buffalo Museum of Science was a gem. Story 13, Varanasi, India. Our trip leader decided it would be a good idea for our group to stay in a hotel really close to the main ghat. While cars are banned in that part of the city, scooters are not, and they are blaring their horns 24/7. Add to that the constant bell ringing and the sheer amount of people, and it is noisy as hell. I had a street-facing room and couldn't sleep even with noise-canceling headphones on. The people in the alley-facing rooms fared no better, as screaming monkeys were trying to break into the rooms, and at least one person found a nest of dead rats. There was no drain in the bathroom, which I didn't realize until after taking a brief shower, which resulted in me having to scoop the water into a tiny sink like I was bailing a sinking boat. Outside of the hotel wasn't a whole lot better, not only because of the noise, but also the piles of cow everywhere and the large open-air crematoriums making it hard to breathe. That city sucked and I will never go back. Story 14. Indiana, but specifically Evansville, broke down there. Walked from the hotel we landed at to a Honda repair shop. My son and I are walking down the side of this major road and the shoulder is carpeted in cigarette butts. And I mean carpeted. For 2 miles it looked like someone had poured out the contents of thousands of ashtrays. And those were just the 2 miles we walked. Just a mean, angry town. Story 15. NYC. My wallet was stolen at a restaurant in East Harlem, and when I went to the police about it, instead of helping me out and taking down my information, they decided to scold me and my classmates for getting an Airbnb in the neighborhood instead of an expensive hotel in Midtown Manhattan like good little tourists do. This was 2016. We were college students and had spent the whole year saving money just for the plane tickets out so we could visit art museums. The locals were mostly very nice, but NYC cops, I'll never go back except for business purposes because of them. Story 16. I had to spend a week in Mazatlan some years ago making a promotional video for a timeshare outfit. The cartels were having a moment in the town, so we were pretty much confined to the walled timeshare compound and warned not to leave, especially after dark. There was a nice-looking beach, but the surf was rank with sewage, and if you ventured down there, child beggars and desperate vendors would swarm you. The place was staffed by resentful-looking locals, and the guests were mainly old white Europeans and Americans who seemed to get off on the power imbalance, so it was always tense. When our week was up, we were driven at high speed back to the airport while naked children on the roadside threw rocks at our car. We made the resort look warm and inviting in the video, but it was the worst kind of misleading propaganda, and I've always felt bad about it. Story 17. Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, Canada, stayed overnight on a road trip from Toronto to Vancouver. It was my first time in the true north of the province, and it just had the weirdest vibe. Extremely run down, no liveliness or vibrancy at all. Very sketchy-looking people everywhere. I went on a walk to see a bit of the city after dinner, probably like 7:30, 8 at night, and it was so dead you could literally hear a pin drop. It made me feel genuinely uncomfortable. Story 18, Cambodia. The locals were so rude and annoying. Everything was super overpriced compared to the rest of CE. We stayed in this hostel that was supposed to help orphans, but it was just a mask to have free child labor. Then I did the ing fields, and that left a bad feeling in my mouth. Suddenly, I understood the people. Basically, this guy committed genocide based on intellect. so as to expect most people are uneducated or low IQ. It's just a sad, depressing place. Story 19, Paris, but I'd call it the least best instead. The visit was this one-day guided tour that happened to be on a French holiday of some sort, so it started late. Then we were rushed through all the main tourist traps, including the one meal I had in France, a slice of pizza at the Eiffel Tower, which was as bad as it sounds. This is a terrible way to experience a place. A goal of mine is to have a proper do-over. Story 20. China, the air quality was totally disgusting. I had to wear a mask the entire time I was there, and this was way before COVID. The streets were so crowded and exhausted, it was just awful. And where we were, the people were not too appreciative of Americans. My students and I were denied service on numerous occasions. The second time I went, it wasn't nearly as bad, but it was still a shock to my immune system. Story 21. I had a pretty bad experience in Rome. While the sights were amazing, the crowds and the overwhelming number of tourists made it hard to enjoy anything. The metro system was overcrowded and confusing, and some of the local vendors were pushy. Plus, the prices were much higher than expected in popular areas. The combination of these issues really dampened my experience. Story 22, Lagos, Nigeria. Lived there for work for 3 years. Polluted, stinky, and nearly everything is broken because people try to steal literally everything. Medical waste in the ditches and creeks. People ting on the side of the road or in a bucket and dumping it in the creek 50 feet upstream of someone washing their dishes in the same water. Don't forget about the random dead body you may see sitting on the side of Telhi Road for a few days or maybe a week. Also seeing kids that have been maimed by their parents to make them more effective beggars. I think almost everyone I worked with there suffered from anxiety issues at some point. Have been to lots of places around the world, but nothing was like that place. Story 23, Cancun, Hotel Zone. I'm not super well traveled, but each place I visited had its own character. Even non-tourist places like Minneapolis or Madison have character. Cancun Hotel Zone is just a stinking pile of hotels, scams, and zero culture beyond trying to get your money. I think this is where all tourist locations end up eventually, and Cancun just has a head start. I'd prefer to just go to Miami. Cheaper flights and honestly more Hispanic culture than the Hotel Zone. Story 24. Delhi. I cannot believe there hasn't been more mentions of this. Absolutely terrible. From the pollution to the poverty to the insane traffic and road noise all the time. Add to that not being able to breathe clean air. To top it all off, probably the most unsafe my GF has ever felt, as she gets gawked at by 30 grown men at a time. And the way the rich treat the poor is absolutely deplorable, like they are lower than dirt. Story 25. Tangier, Morocco. There are lots of cool places in Morocco, but this place, outside of the hotel, Grand Hotel Villa de France, literally everything was dirty. Even at the famed Café Haifa, they didn't clean anything. The people were okay, but extremely aggressive and not in the same way they were in other cities in Morocco. The whole time there, we basically just wanted to go back to Chefchaouen or Marrakesh or Casablanca. Story 26. The United Arab Emirates, definitely. I've never seen such a boring and empty place. I love history and art, and the time spent in Dubai and other Emirates was the most boring and uninteresting in my life. The pretentious glitter causes laughter rather than admiration. A place for stupid people who like to throw money around, go shopping all day, and take photos for social networks. People are quite rude and unfriendly. They look at you like you are some kind of lower creature. I thought I would enjoy the trip, but I was completely disappointed. Behind the visible external glitter, there is desolation, emptiness, and boredom, as if a desperate homeless person put on a bunch of shiny things and tried to seem rich. Story 27. Jerusalem. Given that it has such a reputation, maybe I built it up too much in my mind and I was so excited to see it. But I was so let down. Everyone was super hostile and unfriendly. Our Airbnb ate us over, and the taxi driver tried to scam us. Happy to never go back there, except for the food. The food was delicious, even though extremely expensive to eat out. Story 28. Egypt. So disappointing as it was, the one country I had wanted to visit for as long as I could remember. I was obsessed with ancient Egypt as a kid. The constant UL harassment despite being with my husband shocked me, and I say that as someone who solo traveled extensively before and being treated like an ATM cash cow by basically everyone. I honestly feel like I did not have a single genuine interaction with anyone there. It felt predatory and I couldn't relax at all. Also possibly petty or perhaps stupid, unresearched on my part. But the total disappointment of finding out the pyramids were like a 10-minute drive from the city and not in the middle of the desert shocked me, haha. Cuba was a close second in terms of harassment, but I feel I met a lot of genuine people there as well that balanced things out. Comparatively, the best countries I've visited by far are Iran and Mexico, which surprises a lot of people as I traveled solo as a blonde girl in my 20s. Story 29. Worst city was Liverpool. I didn't hate it, but out of all the other places I went on that trip, London and Edinburgh, plus a travel through Wales and most of Ireland, it was the city I liked least. It also didn't help that it downpoured the entire time I was there. My phone was in my back pocket. I had a sweatshirt and a raincoat both covering the pocket, using an umbrella as well, and my phone still got so wet it wouldn't charge for a few hours. The whole bachelorette party thing isn't really my scene either, and the club I went to was so packed that I was squished against a wall for most of the night. The one highlight was a small cafe I went to, where I had the absolute best cup of Earl Grey I've ever drank in my life. It was cool to see Liverpool, but I have no desire or need to go back. Story 30, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, teest roads I've ever driven on, and I've lived in a few cities in South America. The residents are oddly aggressively proud of their rundown city. It has so much potential, but just kind of where they could improve, but they think it's so great already. 2/10 would not recommend. Story 31. Quite horrifying how often creepy men are coming up as a reason for places being the awful to visit. Personally, I was SA'd despite traveling with my brother and dad. It only took staying in my one room in a safe hotel for one night, and I had felt very secure as my dad was in the next room. Story 32. Las Colinas, Texas. I mean, it's fine. The corporate suburbs are okay. The horse statue is actually amazing, but I was on a business trip and a job I didn't want, taking a class I wasn't interested in with people I didn't like, walking back and forth to a hotel by myself for like 2 weeks. The depths of despair in that mundane situation can get pretty bad. Story 33. I ended up getting what could be construed as a gang tattoo. It's not. So I'd never have to go back to Honduras. Completely miserable country full of miserable poor people. Leaving the airport, some little kids approached my car begging for money, and when I said no, they pulled out a knife to scratch said car, to which my lunatic stepdad pulled a machete out on them, which actually got those little bastards to back off. Story 34. Monaco was a disappointment. Sure, the yachts are shiny, the cars are fast, and the price tags are astronomical, but where's the soul? Everything felt like it was trying so hard to justify the price of admission, but the service? Mediocre at best. The food? So forgettable, I think I actually forgot it mid-bite. It was like a theme park for people who want to cosplay as rich. It's all flash and no substance, like a designer handbag stuffed with instant noodles. Saint-Tropez? Oh, the same story. It's a playground for those who've recently discovered the joys of having money and think Gucci logos are a personality trait. Overhyped, overpriced, and entirely too obsessed with appearances. I was hoping for a touch of Riviera elegance, but instead, I got a lot of people taking selfies with their plates of gold-dusted truffle pasta. Don't get me wrong, I love luxury, but only when it's done with taste and authenticity, neither of which were on the menu. I remember I went to a restaurant in Saint-Tropez where a 1-liter bottle of water was 30 euros. Yes, 30, for water. And the food? Don't even get me started. I paid what felt like a mortgage payment for a basic plate of pasta. To make it even better, they kindly reminded me I could only stay at my table for 2 hours, unless, of course, I wanted to order more. Because nothing says luxury like being politely rushed out after dropping a small fortune on carbs and overpriced hydration. Anyone else find these places exhausting? Or did I just visit on try-hard week? Story 35. New Orleans during Mardi Gras, just a few months before Katrina hit. There was absolutely nothing fun or enjoyable about it. Some friends wanted to go, so I just went along with it. Never again. I felt like I was walking around in a sewer. Mardi Gras has to be the most overhyped spectacle in the U.S. The food was horrible, too. I literally had to run back to the hotel to make it to the bathroom. I learned the hard way why they call it a po' boy. The hotel was gross, and even the airport was run down and gloomy. And I recall it having that sterile hospital smell. I would never go back to that town. Story 36, Anaheim. It a Vegas for obnoxious families. The plane there filled with entitled parents and feral kids. We had to go there for business, and it was hard to get sleep because so many guests at the same hotel were on vacation, drinking and congregating on their balconies for hours, making so much noise at breakfast, loud in the hallways at night. We could not wait to leave. My manager vowed to never go there for business again. Story 37. Manila. Walking around the city, you can feel the insane contrast between the wealth and poverty in the city. On top of that, the amount of passport bros and overall creepy old men with incredibly young-looking local women. It also didn't help that when I went to visit Chinatown, I strolled down a few wrong streets and felt incredibly unsafe. It felt like everyone was watching me and knew I was a foreigner. Not a fun destination as a solo traveler. Story 38, Saudi Arabia, but I am female. I was deployed to Prince Sultan Air Base and went on a trip into town as a reward. We had to cover our hair and wear a burqa, which was not that bad, but when we went to stores, the shopkeepers would not speak to us directly. We had to tell our male guide what we wanted, and he would then relay it. We ate at a Turkish restaurant because they would allow us to be seated in a private room where we could remove our hair covers. We had to enter through a back entrance. It was just a very uncomfortable and honestly scary trip to know everyone around you does not value you as much as a man. That being said, the trip the men went on said they had a good time, so apparently only if you are female. Story 39. Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. One of the most polluted cities I've ever been to, out of 91 countries. Neo-Nazis roaming the streets looking to knife anyone looking vaguely non-Mongolian, and pickpockets around every corner. The temples and palaces weren't too bad, but not when compared to other Tibetan Buddhist temples in China. The worst of all was the food. It's hard to describe how bad everything tasted. There was a lot of lamb and a lot of pork, but everything was broadly unflavored and tasted sort of rancid. Chinese and Korean restaurants ended up being my refuge. Once you leave UB though, everything gets much nicer. Story 40. Barcelona. Seriously, I can't understand how unsafe it was, even for being in Southern Europe. Weird looks and being followed by people in the old town. Also, everything is overpriced by mass tourism. Most of places felt like tourist traps, weed shops everywhere, and sketchy souvenir places. All landmarks in the old town were massified. It felt like a mix of an amusement park and being an animal in a farm sometimes. Waste of time and money. It all looks good on Insta, but in reality it's a different thing. Story 41. Dominican Republic. Didn't know it had very high crime rate. The all-inclusive resort I was at was a big compound, closed even during the day, but they didn't stop you from exiting. After a day or two wanted something other than the disco, walked down the road to some little coliseum that was lit up like a Christmas tree. We barely made it there, discovered it was cockfighting night when the police grabbed us and drove us back. Apparently, we would not have made it out alive, not to mention they didn't want the tourists to know about the cockfighting. Did drive into the city to some fort, which was boring as hell. This was the highlight. They took us to the official cigar alcohol store. The cohibas were supposed to be government-approved official plus a few others. They were all fake. Moral of the story is never leave the resort. Story 42. Freetown, Sierra Leone. Chaotic mess, falling apart at the seams. Everything just feels dire and depressing. You can see the glimpses of a better past peeling from the unmaintained buildings. Shortages of fuel, water, electricity, expensive, noisy, crowded, dirty air. Restaurants cook the food in the morning and it sits out all day getting cold and filled with bacteria. Insane traffic, plenty of pollution, poverty, public defecation, urination, crime, and corruption. The dump is in the middle of town and constantly burning trash so that toxic smoke chokes everyone. The city has all the negatives of the developing world with none of the perks and all the negatives of the developed world too. There were multiple syringes on the beach, washed up medical waste, condoms, and loads of trash. Got robbed at knife point during the day by 3 young men who opened the door to the car and got inside. Everywhere you go, people warn you to watch out. Not safe to go anywhere after dark. To get to and from the airport is a nightmare because it is on the opposite side of the bay, so you have to haggle for a taxi to a ferry to another taxi. No street lights, days without water or electricity. During COVID, they made you bring in a form that said you had tested negative. Then when arrived, you had to take 2 tests, a blood and rapid test, at the airport before they would let you leave, and they held on to your passport, which you would have to go pick up a week later across town in a tent with huge lines. It took hours. Then when you left, you had to pay them again to go sit in a forever line in an awkwardly positioned place, jammed up with many other people so they could test you again. I would have been okay with the testing, but it was more a money-making scheme than anything else. It's a shame because it would be beautiful country otherwise. The country has never really recovered from the war, just deteriorating at a rapid pace. Story 43. Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. I was pickpocketed by a whore while walking down the street after visiting an ATM. I was also pulled over and held at gunpoint by policemen while they searched my car and hinted at wanting a bribe. Pretending I didn't understand the language prevented me from paying that bribe, but they took all my groceries I had just bought. Story 44. Turkey, all scams. Tour guide took us to a carpet-making school filled with ringers, actors, trying to convince us to buy a handmade carpet. On the one hand, the size of the scam was impressive, fake weavers, but it just made me never want to visit Turkey again. No, we did not buy a carpet, although I did get suckered into paying $5 for a coffee I thought was complimentary. Story 45. I don't know if I would say awful, but defiantly something that has opened my eyes and makes me very sad. I've spent a lot of time in Colombia since my GEF is from here, and not in a very safe city. There is a lot to be said about this country, good and bad, But the worst thing I've seen personally is in Cartagena when we have visited there. Very beautiful old town, but a couple km to the east is coastal La Mangrove area, which is absolutely full of trash and garbage. It's so sad, it's literally like an oceanic landfill. Swimming in the beaches there, it's common for plastic wrappers and cups to wash up on you with the waves. Such an amazing place with so many tourists and so much good food and potential for beaches, but the garbage, man. Also, it floods every single time it rains. Every single time. Story 46, Paris. As a pardon no parler français person who was visiting as a sort of an impulsive weekend trip from London, I had some of the worst interactions with random folks ever. Perhaps I had very high expectations of being treated like a human being, but apparently if you aren't Parisian, you aren't worthy of that. One would think that with so much wonderful French wine and bread within reach, folks would be nicer. Instead, I found folks walking around with a giant stick up their behinds. Story 47. I've been to Scotland once. I remember it much as one recalls a dream or a nightmare. I was on a budget flight to Norway when a storm forced us to ditch in Prestwick. It's so hilly up there you can't get any signal on your car phone. It looked bad. It looked like I'd have to spend the night in Glasgow. The cabin crew suggested we all go out and club it. I had no option. It was that or one of their B&Bs. I figured it'd be safer on the streets. For the first time ever, I saw the Scotch in their natural habitat. And it weren't pretty. I'd seen them huddling in stations before, being loud, but this time I was surrounded. Everywhere I went, it felt like they were watching me. Fish-white flesh puckered by the Highland breeze. Tight eyes peering out for fresh meat. Screechy, booze-soaked voices hollering out for a taxi to take them halfway up the road to the next all-night watering hole. A shatter of glass. A round of applause. A 16-year-old mother of 3 vomiting in an open sewer. Bairns looking on, chewing on potato cakes. I ain't never going back. Not never. Story 48. Surprisingly, because I haven't traveled all that much, I would say Palermo, Sicily, and the reason why is because once we arrived, it literally felt like I was not in Europe anymore. One-way roads were multi-way roads. Also, I saw so many scams and just really dodgy business being done there with children involved. The price they would present to you would never be the same and just would flat out overcharge you because they knew you weren't from there. Blah. But I will say one really surprising thing. The food was out of this world. Just your basic arancini was filled with flavor. I don't know how they did it, but food quality was out of this world. I understand the history of the mafia in Sicily, so it is all connected. Just shocking to get culture shock in Europe. Story 49, Greyhound Station in Buffalo, New York. I'm fairly well traveled, and that place was pure hell. The Guilin Railway Station in China. I have a feeling it's probably better now, as this was nearly 20 years ago. There was just something really sinister about it, and the people stared at us, white men and women, like we had 2 heads. Weird place. Story 50, El Salvador. As a child, my family drove across the U.S., down through Mexico and into Central America. When we got to the El Salvador border, they took my father's passport, stuck an automatic weapon through our truck window, and arrested all of us. We were taken to the governor's house where he said we were free to leave if we gave his nephew a ride to university. We did, and then headed back home. Adventure over. Story 51, Anchorage, Alaska. The rest of the state has some of the most beautiful scenery in the entire U.S., and the smaller towns in Alaska are awesome. But Anchorage is a depressing place. Aggressive homeless people everywhere, residents are gloomy and downtrodden, and someone broke into my rental car while we were parked at a city park. Didn't have any valuables in it, but still. And this was in July. Can't even imagine what the place is like in January. Story 52, Mason, O. My dad and I always used to stay there if we have to stop for the night on our way to my brother's house because it's about halfway. In November 2022, my dad and I went to the Mason Super 8 with the intent of just staying the night. At 6 the next morning, my dad got sick with a kidney stone, and I had to call 911. The operator and the paramedics were fine, but the hotel staff were awful. My dad was taken to the East Lebanon Hospital and then got transferred to a hospital in Cincy. He left me alone in the hotel with $5K worth of things in the hotel room. I had to walk down to the front desk 3 times just to get an extension on the room for that night. It doesn't help that I cry when I'm annoyed, hungry, and just want to go back to bed. So yeah, Mason O and Super 8. Story 53, Boston. Will clarify that I like the city overall. I don't think I visited anywhere that was straight up bad, but the way PPL drove even on the outskirts of Boston was an experience. Almost got into an accident like 5 times, and lanes would seem to merge or turn weird directions with no notice. Also, PPL would cross the street with absolutely no sense of self-preservation. Absolutely terrible driving experience, and I wasn't even the driver. I was in the passenger seat reading maps and watching out for traffic low way. Story 54. Not awful per se, but eye-opening in a disappointing way. Flyover states in the USA. I spent a month in the States, traveling west to east. By the time I'd visited, I'd been to about 60 countries or so around the world, and I was surprised and disappointed by how little they had to offer and how inwardly focused they were, like boring food, not much to see or do. Nature was wonderful, but there's nature in other places. And speaking to locals, it was obvious they kind of didn't care about the world and were just very helya-merka, kind of living up to the stereotype. And the more I travel, the more I kind of think back and stand by that. As an international tourist, I'd not recommend America as a destination to people who haven't seen more of the word. It's large and expensive, and value for money isn't all that. Even Canada has more. Take the money and spend it in Asia, you'll see more, do more, have brighter and more colorful impressions, and learn more about yourself, the world, and the history. Story 55, Oklahoma City. The drivers are terrible. There's barely anything exciting to do. Everyone looks like they do meth crack, and to the people I've talked to look like their teeth are hanging by a thread. It's very hot and dry, and there's just nothing interesting to do. And compared to Chicago, just lacks culture. I guess the only saving grace is the OKC Thunder are great, and if you like warm weather, you like Oklahoma. But other than that, it's just very forgettable. Even Tulsa and Edmond have more going for them. Story 56, Soweto, South Africa. We were on a tour that took us to a museum and then to Nelson Mandela's house. We were a big tour bus of mainly white people. As we were driving, I could see people staring at us. We stopped for lunch and sat outside to eat. We had groups of people who would walk over and perform for us for money. As we walked to Mandela's house, we were the center of attention, and I felt like we were going to get robbed at any moment. Worst poverty I've ever seen. It's hard to describe except incredibly heartbreaking. Story 57. St. Lucia is terrible. I have ranted before about that damn island. If I were to pick a city, it would have to be Rio de Janeiro, specifically the city center. I stayed 2 nights there for an event which all had to attend in formal wear, and I had never seen such levels on nosiness and general inconvenient behavior from the people, not even mentioning the absolute chaos and dirtiness of the streets. The 200-odd meters we had to walk to go from the hotel to the event were some of the most uncomfortable walks I ever had. If for some reason you need to go there, please stick to the south of the city. You'll have a decent time there. Stay out of the center. Story 58, Santiago, Chile. It was the last stop on a rather large nature-focused tour that started in Argentina, went to Patagonia, but the last city to visit was there. We were in a tour group, so the bus took us into the city. The slums was like nothing I could even conceive of. I don't travel much. Broke my heart. The city center was nice, but yeesh, stark contrast of money. The guide mentioned that they lowered the overall pollution of city in no time flat by redistricting the copper foundries as not the city. Most cyberpunk dystopic thing I'd ever heard of. The trip was amazing though. Just Santiago? Oof. Story 59, St. Helier, Jersey. Some woman tried to run off with my bag during the airport screening on the way in, and the airport staff just let it happen in front of them. My B&B staff were super rude when I told them the kettle in my room didn't have its power cable. Didn't get better from there. The weather was, and all public transport had stopped for winter the day before, so I couldn't visit anywhere. I was there for a wedding, but I had half a day when I could have done the tourist thing. Ended up getting a ride back to the airport sooner than I needed because it sucked, and I just wanted to leave. Story 60, Moscow and Switzerland. Yes, the whole country were far from awful. In fact, it was fantastic. But the surprise at how nasty and anti-tourist some of the people could be was wild. Edit. Now that I'm thinking about it, St. Petersburg was about the same. Maybe a little more friendly, but also a lot more drunk. People got very handsy, and it didn't take much to set them off. Story 61, Shanghai. The whole city felt like a movie set that was under construction, and the air smelled like plastic. Hard to get around anywhere. We took a cab, and when we paid, the driver started yelling that our money was not China money, even though it was just the bills that we had gotten at the currency exchange at the airport. We were in the heart of Shanghai, yet it seemed like there was strangely not that many shops or restaurants. Took a riverboat one night to see the colorful skyscrapers. We lined up to get on the boat, and when they opened the gate to get on, literally, everyone else started running to get on the boat so they could get a good spot. Then, once everyone was on board, people were crowding the side of the boat where you could see stuff and shoving their phones in the air to take pictures. So much that we couldn't see anything. We weren't about to shove our way to the edge, so we just looked from the center of the boat. The U-Garden was nice, and the Bund is cool, I guess, but I didn't come to Asia to look at Western-style buildings. Every other city I'd been to in Asia, Hanoi, Bangkok, Chiang Mai, Taipei, all over Japan, seemed to be just bursting with stuff to do and see. But Shanghai was extremely disappointing considering it's called the Paris of the Orient. Story 62, Liverpool. I got the train down to visit a friend who worked at the uni there. My phone broke. I tried to ask people for directions, and the only person who would help me was a Scottish guy. Made me feel so awful. I was 25F in a city I don't know, and no locals would even stop to help. Just the only other Scottish person, also a stranger, that I happened to bump into. On the other hand, I used to live in Glasgow. I'm from Edinburgh, and Glaswegians are, for the most part, salt of the earth. Wonderfully friendly people. Story 63. Marrakesh is an amazing, interesting place with great food. However, the people are incredibly difficult to deal with, constantly trying to extort money from tourists through tricks, manipulation, and even outright aggression. My wife found the men to be very lechy also. Definitely the most stressful holiday I've had. But honestly, I've been to around 60 coup tries at this point and even enjoyed Marrakesh. Everywhere has value, and more often than not, your outlook is what decides whether you have a good holiday. Even my worst trips have had highlights. Story 64, Brussels, Belgium. It might not hold a candle to some of the responses in this thread, but I've only really traveled around Europe. It's filthy pretty much everywhere. Cigarette butts piled high against the curb, busted portaloos surrounded by literal instead of proper public toilets. It's clearly got so much wealth and could be such a gorgeous place, but the amount of poverty is viscerally obvious. The first time I went, I stayed in an area which felt ghettoized. Clearly an ethnic enclave where the city government had put zero investment into emptying the bins, sweeping the streets, providing things to look at or do, etc. The citizens seemed miserable. Not just the commuters, but the people playing chess in the park, sipping coffees in cafes, or wandering around their museums. Story 65, Portland, Oregon. The trip wasn't awful. I just found it hard to ignore how dystopian the downtown is. Between my destinations, the streets were deserted. The transit was always 50% homeless or crazy people, one of them emitting the worst smell I've ever smelled in my life. And yeah, I enjoyed the restaurants and cafes, but nothing I couldn't get at home. Voodoo Donuts was a super fun store, but they just tasted like sugar. It's the only place where I was like, I just want to go home. Story 66, Macau. Went there on a 2018 trip to Hong Kong. Nice, but now wouldn't go back. And Taipei, fantastic. I should note I'm white, but my wife is from South Asia. Not China, but she speaks Cantonese and Mandarin at native level. So we were both tourists, but able to know what was going on. Great egg tarts. Nice if unspectacular old town, that's about it. The swarms of people who'd come from mainland China to gamble, hanging out and smoking on almost every corner. The streets full of pawn shops directly across the road from these hideously ugly casinos. The incredibly rude security guards at the museum we wandered into when we asked if we could change our baby. Our hotel window looking out onto a half-demolished hotel, seemingly abandoned in state. The fact that every single toilet had the paper removed because otherwise people would apparently steal it. The time when my wife observed that the water with our otherwise okay meal, minchi at Requexo, tasted of cockroach. When the taxi driver back to the bus station ripped us off with a ridiculous fare, I guess because he felt he could. This sort of general feeling of grubbiness and dirt pervading the place, like a monument to decadence, but not even the luxury sort of decadence, but rather the aspirational desperation of gambling addiction. At a time when HK was in a virtual open rebellion against Chinese rule, one that failed Natch, Macau was a testament to supplication and soullessness. Story 67, Athens, Greece. Lovely city, but I was there during their meltdown on my anniversary. We got off the beach tram to go back to our hotel to change and head to a lovely dinner. Instead, we got off into absolute chaos with tear gas, Molotov cocktails, and our hotel barricaded so we couldn't get in. I had taken my shirt off to cover my wife's face, and I lost my pants when they went up in flames. After that, standing there in just my boxers screaming into the void while banging on the hotel barricade, they finally opened it enough for us to crawl under. Our anniversary's room service was delicious.